The land had been in my family for generations, a stretch of rolling hills and dense woodland that bordered the edge of our quiet town. My grandfather used to say it was more than just soil and trees, it was freedom. He farmed a portion of it, raised cattle on the open fields, and built a modest cabin where our family gathered every summer. Over the years, the town grew, the suburbs expanded, and HOAs began to sprout like weeds, wrapping their rules around every neighborhood. But my land stayed untouched, a stubborn reminder of independence in a world that seemed desperate to regulate everything. I inherited the property after my father passed away, and while I didn't live there full-time, I visited often. For me, it wasn't about profit or development, it was about preserving something pure. Developers had approached me dozens of times with flashy offers, promising fortunes if I just let them carve up the land into lots. I always refused. The land wasn't for sale. It wasn't just mine, it was a piece of my family's story, and no contract or HOA board was going to rewrite that. Still, every year the pressure grew. The nearby HOA had expanded aggressively, swallowing smaller neighborhoods, promising luxury living behind their gates. I ignored them, thinking they'd respect boundaries. But whispers began to circulate in town, rumors of a new subdivision, Phase 4, that would double the size of the HOA community. When I saw the blueprints at the county office, my stomach tightened. The dotted lines of their plan didn't stop at their borders. They reached into my land, slicing it into neat little parcels, as if my family's legacy was just another patch of dirt to be paved over. At first, I told myself it was a clerical mistake, some lazy surveyor copying lines where they didn't belong. But the more I looked into it, the clearer it became. The HOA and their developer partners had every intention of building on my property. They had submitted plans, pulled permits, and even sold a few lots that weren't theirs to sell. It felt surreal, like someone had tried to rob me in broad daylight while the whole town looked the other way. I remember standing on a ridge one evening, looking out over the stretch of land where survey stakes now dotted the fields. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of construction from the neighboring subdivision. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory, "This land will always be ours, so long as we stand our ground." I clenched my fists and made a silent promise that night. If the HOA wanted a war, I was ready to give them one. The first signs of expansion arrived quietly, like a storm building on the horizon. Trucks rolled in at dawn, heavy equipment rumbling through the dirt roads that had once been part of my family's pastures. I drove out one morning to find surveyors hammering stakes into the ground, bright orange flags fluttering in the breeze like warnings I hadn't been meant to ignore. When I asked what they were doing, one of them shrugged casually and said, "New development. Phase 4. HOA approved it months ago." The way he said it, as if I was supposed to already know, lit a fire in my chest. Within weeks, the transformation was undeniable. Bulldozers carved out wide scars where wildflowers used to bloom, and trucks hauled in gravel to lay the foundation for roads that didn't belong. Billboards went up along the highway, glossy advertisements boasting about luxury homes starting in the 500s. I drove past one of them and felt sick to my stomach when I saw the artist's rendering, a neat row of houses lined up exactly where my grandfather's barn once stood. The arrogance of it all was staggering. They weren't just taking land, they were erasing history. I tried to reason with them at first. I went to the HOA office, a sterile building at the heart of their gated kingdom, and asked to speak with the board president. She was a woman named Barbara, short, sharp-eyed, with a kind of smile that never touched her eyes. I laid out the facts. The land wasn't theirs, the deeds were clear, and they had no right to build on it. She listened, tapping her pen against the desk, then leaned forward with a smirk. "This community has already invested millions in development," she said smoothly. "You'd be wise to cooperate. Fighting us will only cost you more than you can imagine." That was the moment I realized the HOA wasn't just mistaken, they were deliberate. They believed money and influence gave them the right to steamroll anyone in their path. Barbara spoke with the confidence of someone who had lawyers on retainer and city officials on speed dial. She wasn't asking me to compromise, she was warning me to surrender. But I'd inherited more than just land from my family, I'd inherited their stubbornness too. As I left the office, construction crews were already moving deeper into my property. The sound of chainsaws echoed across the hills, a constant reminder that the HOA's grip was tightening. I knew then that this was more than a dispute over property lines. It was a battle for respect, for legacy, for the principle that no one, no matter how powerful, had the right to take what didn't belong to them. And if they thought I'd roll over quietly, they had no idea what kind of fight they'd started. At first, I thought maybe the bulldozers would stop short of the ridge. Maybe they'd realize their mistake and turn back. But one afternoon, I drove out to check the property and found fresh tire tracks carved deep into the soil well past the boundary markers. Wooden stakes bearing the HOA's insignia were hammered into the earth, as if their cheap plywood signs could erase decades of family ownership. My heart sank when I saw the beginnings of concrete foundations being poured, on my land, not theirs. The line between their property and mine had been crossed, not by accident, but by intention. I walked up to the crew, my boots crunching over the gravel they'd spread, and demanded to know who authorized the work. The foreman, a burly man in a neon vest, didn't even look up from his clipboard. "The HOA," he said flatly. "We've got permits." When I told him the land wasn't theirs to touch, he simply shrugged, like it wasn't his problem. That shrug cut deeper than his words. It told me everything. They didn't care whose land it was. As far as they were concerned, the HOA's word was law, and the rest of us were just background noise. The next morning, I found one of their trucks parked right at the edge of my grandfather's cabin. The porch boards creaked under my weight as I stared at the vehicle, its company logo splashed proudly across the side. A few workers lounged nearby, smoking cigarettes, laughing as if they owned the place. Rage burned in my chest, but when I confronted them, they just pointed to a sheet of paper taped to the truck window. It was a notice from the HOA declaring the area designated construction zone. My cabin, the place where generations of my family had gathered, was now, in their eyes, nothing more than an obstacle in their development plans. I went back to the county office that day, waving the deed to my land in front of a clerk who barely bothered to look up from her computer. She mumbled something about permits and property disputes, then told me to consult an attorney. It felt like slamming into a brick wall. The system was supposed to protect me, but every door I knocked on seemed to close before I could get a word out. Meanwhile, the HOA pressed forward, confident that bureaucracy and red tape would work in their favor. That night, I stood on the porch of the cabin, listening to the distant hum of machines as they chewed into the earth. The stars above seemed colder than I remembered, the land quieter, as though it already knew it was being stolen piece by piece. My grandfather's words came back to me again, and this time they weren't a gentle reminder, they were a warning. The HOA had crossed the line. They hadn't just trespassed, they had declared war. And I was done waiting for someone else to fight it for me. I marched back into the HOA's office the next morning, the deed to my land clutched so tightly in my hand that the edges had crumpled. The receptionist, who had already seen me once before, barely disguised her annoyance as she buzzed the board president. Within minutes, Barbara appeared, her heels clicking against the polished tile floor like a metronome of authority. She looked at me as though I were a nuisance instead of the rightful owner of the land her crews were destroying. I laid the papers on her desk with a thud, my voice steady but sharp. "You're building on my land. This stops now." Barbara picked up the deed, glanced at it briefly, and set it down with a sigh as if it were a child's drawing rather than a legally binding document. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Mr. Miller," she said coolly, "these homes have already been promised to families. Contracts have been signed, money has changed hands. If you continue to fight this, you'll not only be battling us, you'll be battling dozens of future homeowners." Her words dripped with practiced confidence, as though the sheer weight of the HOA's influence could intimidate me into surrendering. I leaned across her desk, locking eyes with her. "I don't care who you've promised them to. You had no right to sell what wasn't yours. That land belongs to me, and you know it." My voice was low but carried the force of generations who had bled and sweated on that soil. For the first time, her smirk faltered, just slightly, before she straightened her posture and slid a paper across the desk. It was an offer, a buyout. An insultingly low figure, wrapped in legal jargon that basically said, "Sign this, take the money, and disappear." I tore the paper in half without even reading past the first line. Barbara's eyes narrowed, the mask of civility slipping away. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "The HOA has ways of making life difficult for people who refuse to cooperate." Her words were less a threat and more a promise, one she fully intended to keep. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind. Fines, lawsuits, harassment. She believed she had the power to bury me under paperwork and pressure until I gave up. But she didn't know me. She didn't know that I'd inherited not just the land, but the stubborn will of every man and woman who had defended it before me. As I walked out of that office, the air outside felt heavier, charged with the knowledge that the battle lines had now been drawn. The HOA wasn't going to stop, and neither was I. What had started as a property dispute was quickly becoming something much larger, a test of who would break first. For Barbara and her board, this was just another development project. For me, it was war. My first step after the confrontation was to hire an attorney. I found a local property lawyer, a man named Harris, whose office walls were lined with faded certificates and dusty law books. He listened intently as I laid out the situation, flipping through the deed and the surveys I brought with me. His brow furrowed, and he tapped a pen against the table. "You're in the right here," he said finally. "On paper, it's clear. But in practice, this could get messy." His hesitation made my stomach knot. Messy was exactly what the HOA wanted. Harris filed an injunction to halt construction, and for a brief moment, I felt like progress had been made. But within a week, the county clerk's office claimed the paperwork was incomplete, and construction roared on without pause. When Harris pressed them, he was met with vague answers and sudden delays. One morning, he called me, frustration evident in his voice. "It's like they've greased every palm in this county. I can't get a single official to take this seriously." Each time I drove past the site, more walls had gone up, more ground had been lost. It was as if the law itself had been bought and paid for by the HOA. I even tried bringing the issue to the town council, standing at the podium during a public meeting with my deed in hand. I spoke about the theft of my family's land, the illegal expansion, the arrogance of an HOA that thought itself above the law. Some in the audience nodded along, but the council members barely looked up from their papers. When the vote came to investigate further, it failed with barely a murmur. Later, a councilman approached me in private and whispered, "They're too powerful. The HOA funds half the town's budget. You won't win this here." His pity stung worse than his words. The final straw came when I received a letter in the mail, not from the county or the courts, but from the HOA itself. It accused me of obstructing community development and threatened daily fines of $1,000 if I continued interference. The audacity of it nearly made me laugh, but the number at the bottom, tens of thousands of dollars they claimed I already owed, wasn't funny. They weren't just stealing my land, they were trying to bury me in debt, to break me financially until surrender was my only option. That night, I sat in the old cabin with a letter spread across the table, the hum of distant construction echoing through the hills. I'd done everything by the book, hired a lawyer, gone to the council, filed paperwork, and every path had been blocked. Justice, it seemed, wasn't found in offices or courtrooms when money controlled the doors. The HOA had underestimated me when they thought I'd fold under pressure, but they had also underestimated something else. This land held more secrets than they could imagine. And I was ready to use every one of them. The harassment began subtly, almost as if the HOA wanted to test how much pressure I could handle before snapping. First came the letters. Thin envelopes slipped into my mailbox every few days, each one stamped with the HOA's seal. They accused me of violating rules I was never subject to, improper lawn maintenance, unauthorized structures, even failure to submit paint color approval. At first, I laughed. My land wasn't part of their community, and they had no authority over me. But when the fines began to pile up on paper, each one larger than the last, I realized their strategy wasn't about rules. It was about intimidation. Soon after, I noticed unmarked trucks idling at the edge of my property late at night. Their headlights would cut across the cabin walls before disappearing into the darkness. One morning, I found tire tracks gouged into my field, leading right up to the barn doors. The padlock had been smashed, and tools were missing. I called the sheriff's department, but the deputy only shook his head. "We don't have evidence tying this to anyone," he said, though we both knew exactly who was behind it. It was clear the HOA wasn't content with stealing my land. They wanted to break my spirit piece by piece. Barbara herself escalated things in her own way. She showed up at the cabin one afternoon, flanked by two board members in tailored suits. Her smile was sharp as glass. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said, her tone almost sing-song. "Sign over the land, and all these problems will go away." I told her to get off my property before I called the cops, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in close and whispered, "Every day you fight us, you lose more. Think carefully about what you're really protecting here." Then she turned and walked away, leaving muddy boot prints on the porch as if marking her territory. That night, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames as the weight of it all pressed down on me. The land was being eaten alive, the system had turned its back, and the HOA had made it clear they would use every dirty trick in their arsenal. For the first time, I felt something stronger than anger: clarity. They had taken my patience, my trust in the law, and my sense of peace. All that remained was resolve. If they wanted a breaking point, they'd just found it. And in that silence, as the fire crackled low, I remembered something my grandfather once told me when I was a boy exploring the far side of the property. This land has power. It gives life, but it can also take it away if misused. His words lingered in my mind as I thought about the old dam tucked deep in the hills, long forgotten by the town but never forgotten by me. The HOA believed they held all the cards, but they hadn't considered that the land itself might have the final say. The memory came back to me on a late walk through the hills, when I wandered farther than usual, searching for a place where the noise of construction couldn't reach. I found myself standing at the edge of the old dam, its concrete walls weathered and cracked but still sturdy, holding back the wide basin of water that had fed the property for decades. My grandfather built it with his own hands, stacking stones and pouring concrete with the neighbors back in the 1950s. It had served as irrigation for the fields, a fishing spot for kids in the summer, and, in later years, a relic of simpler times. But as I stood there, staring at the calm water behind it, another possibility took root in my mind. The HOA thought they controlled everything. They had their lawyers, their money, their influence, but they didn't know the land like I did. They didn't know about this dam, hidden beyond the ridge where their surveyors never bothered to look. They didn't realize that the ground their Phase 4 subdivision sat on was directly in the path of the valley below. As I traced the outline of their new development in my mind, I couldn't help but imagine what would happen if this dam, this quiet sentinel of my family's land, were to suddenly open. 35 homes, built arrogantly on stolen soil, would lie directly in the flood's path. At first, I tried to shake the thought away. It was too extreme, too destructive. But the more I considered it, the more it made sense. The HOA had left me no other options. They had mocked my family's legacy, stripped me of legal recourse, and threatened to ruin me financially. They believed I was powerless. Yet here, right before me, was proof that I wasn't. My grandfather may not have known how his work would one day serve me, but as I studied the dam's mechanisms, still intact after all these years, I felt as though he had left me a weapon, a way to fight back. Over the following days, I returned to the dam again and again. I inspected the old sluice gates, brushing away rust and dirt to test their strength. They groaned but moved when I put my weight into them. I checked the water level, measured the runoff channels, and realized that years of rainfall had filled the reservoir higher than I had ever seen it. The pressure behind that wall was immense. One pull, one decision, and the water would roar down into the valley like a force of nature. I knew then that this wasn't just a fantasy. It was possible. It was real. Standing there, with the wind whipping across the ridge and the water churning silently behind me, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: control. The HOA had their rules, their signatures, their stamped documents, but none of that mattered against the raw power of the land. They wanted to play gods of the neighborhood, dictating every fence post and flower bed. Let them see what happens when real power, untamed, unstoppable, reminds them of their place. The houses rose quickly, like weeds after a storm. Every day I drove past, there were more of them, rows of identical boxes lined up on what used to be my pasture. 35 homes in all, their vinyl siding gleaming in the sun, the freshly paved streets winding across my land like scars. The sight made my stomach twist, but what broke me wasn't the construction itself. It was the day I saw a family move in. Children ran across the freshly laid sod, their laughter cutting through the air, and I realized the HOA had gone too far. They weren't just stealing from me anymore, they were planting roots, making it harder for me to reclaim what was mine. A week later, Barbara staged her triumph. She hosted a grand opening ceremony at the subdivision, complete with ribbon cutting, balloons, and a catered buffet. Local news cameras rolled as she boasted about the visionary growth of the community. Standing there in her immaculate suit, smiling into the microphones, she spoke as if she had built this place herself, as if my land had always belonged to her. When I showed up at the edge of the crowd, deed in hand, she spotted me and smirked. Then she leaned into the mic and said, "This community is stronger because we don't let obstacles, or opposition, stand in our way." The audience clapped, oblivious to the barbed message hidden in her words. I felt my chest tighten, heat rising in my face. I shouted over the applause, holding the deed high. "This is my land," I yelled. "You built these homes illegally." But the cameras turned away, the reporters shuffled their notes, and the crowd laughed nervously as Barbara waved me off like a heckler. Security moved in quickly, placing a firm hand on my shoulder as if I were the problem, not the theft happening in broad daylight. The humiliation burned deeper than the anger. It wasn't just about losing anymore, it was about being erased. That night, I sat at the kitchen table of the cabin, staring at the stack of violation notices, the mounting fines, the deed that meant nothing to anyone but me. I thought about the family I saw moving in, about the children laughing on grass that wasn't theirs to play on. I thought about Barbara's smirk, her public dismissal, her certainty that she had won. My hands trembled, but not from fear. I had reached the end of patience, of legal channels, of tolerance. There was only one path left, and it was the one my grandfather's dam had carved into the earth long before either of us had been born. I folded the deed carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and tucked it into my jacket pocket. If the law wouldn't defend it, if the town wouldn't acknowledge it, then the land itself would have to speak. And when it did, it would speak with a roar. The HOA thought they had broken me, but in truth, they had built their entire kingdom on a foundation waiting to crumble. The final straw wasn't their homes or their fines, it was their arrogance. And soon, they would learn that arrogance had a price. The night I chose to act was moonless, the sky thick with clouds that smothered the stars. The subdivision below was quiet, its rows of new homes glowing faintly with porch lights and the flicker of televisions inside. From the ridge, I could see them all, 35 houses where my fields once stretched wide and free. I stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of crickets and the distant bark of a dog, until finally I turned my back to the valley and walked toward the dam. My boots crunched against the gravel path, each step heavier than the last, but my resolve didn't waver. The time for warnings and waiting was over. The dam loomed out of the darkness like a slumbering giant, its cracked concrete face damp with years of mist. I set down the lantern I had brought, its soft glow casting long shadows across the weathered walls. My hands found the old iron wheel, the one that controlled the sluice gates. Rust coated its surface, rough beneath my palms, but when I gripped it and leaned my weight into the turn, it shifted with a groan that echoed into the night. The sound was ancient, primal, as if the land itself was waking up after years of silence. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden rush, the water surged through the opening I had carved. It roared like thunder, churning and foaming as it spilled into the channel that led straight down the valley. I stood there, watching as the flood began to gather speed, my heart pounding in time with the torrent. The air grew damp, filled with the smell of earth and rain, and the ground trembled beneath my boots. For the first time since this war began, I felt a grim satisfaction settle in my chest. The HOA had wanted to erase me from my own land. Now my land would erase them instead. I thought of Barbara, of her smirk and her smug speeches, of the board members who laughed as they signed papers that weren't theirs to sign. I thought of the council who turned a blind eye, of the deputies who looked the other way. Each face fueled the steady turn of the wheel as I opened the gates wider, letting the floodwaters pour forth with unstoppable force. I wasn't just opening a dam, I was opening every wound they had carved into me, every insult, every theft, every humiliation. And with each gallon of water unleashed, I felt the balance begin to shift. When the last gate was fully raised, I stepped back and watched the torrent snake its way into the valley below, a silver serpent gleaming in the lantern light. It wound its way toward the subdivision, silent at first but gaining momentum with every passing second. The roar of water filled the night, drowning out the crickets, the dogs, the quiet hum of life below. This was no longer just my fight, it was the land itself taking vengeance. And as the flood surged toward the homes built on stolen soil, I whispered into the night, "Now you'll listen." The first wave struck like a whisper turning into a scream. At the edge of the subdivision, where the new asphalt still smelled of tar, the water crept silently over the curb, pooling in driveways and swallowing flower beds. For a brief moment, it looked harmless, like a heavy rain. Porch lights flickered on, and shadows moved behind curtains as homeowners peeked outside, confused. But then came the roar. A sound so deep, so primal, it rattled windows and made the ground shudder. The creek behind the dam had become a raging river, and it was hungry. Within minutes, streets turned into rivers. Cars bobbed like toys in a bathtub, their alarms blaring uselessly against the flood. Lawns vanished under a churning sea, and fences snapped like matchsticks. Families scrambled out of their homes, clutching children and pets, their screams mixing with the thunder of rushing water. Some tried to drive, their tires spinning helplessly before the current dragged them sideways. Others climbed onto rooftops, waving their arms desperately as the water climbed higher and higher. The 35 houses the HOA had built so proudly were now 35 islands, each one shrinking with every surge. From the ridge, I stood silent, lantern in hand, watching the spectacle unfold. The flood carried with it pieces of everything the HOA had stolen: wooden beams, shingles, trash bins, patio furniture, all swirling together in chaotic judgment. I could see Barbara's house near the center of the subdivision, the largest of them all, its grand porch lights blazing like defiance against the storm. But even her fortress couldn't withstand the surge. The water tore through her yard, lifted her SUV, and slammed it sideways into her garage. I wondered if she still felt untouchable as the land she had mocked swallowed everything she had built. The night stretched on, the water carving new paths through the valley, reshaping the landscape as it pleased. The subdivision that once stood like a monument to arrogance was reduced to fragments, scattered and broken. By dawn, the flood began to recede, leaving behind a wasteland of mud, splintered wood, and silence. Where streets once curved neatly between rows of houses, there was now only ruin, raw, unfiltered proof that the land had reclaimed what was rightfully its own. I stood there until the sun broke over the horizon, painting the wreckage in gold. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't joy, exactly, nor triumph. It was something deeper: vindication. The HOA had taken everything from me, but underestimating the land was their greatest mistake. They thought rules and fines and signatures made them untouchable. But now, standing in the quiet aftermath, I knew the truth. No one, not even the most arrogant, can stand against the force of nature, or the will of a man pushed too far.